Greetings. In the next couple of mini lectures, I want to change the discussion away from elections and politics and kind of talk about the overall environment in which politics takes place. If you look at the top of your page, the title is British Politics, Political Culture, and Class. And the term class, I talked about it a bit earlier when I was in the introductory section, but now I want to actually apply it to British political culture. And Roskin goes into a bit of detail talking about the difference between objective and subjective class. I know that the textbook that I'm using for my American government course goes into quite a bit of detail about the United States having the greatest objective class differences of any advanced democracy in the world. There's greater income and wealth inequality in the United States in 2021 than in European countries, including Great Britain. Now, what's interesting is if we go back and look before the Great Depression, it wasn't even close. Great Britain had the greatest income and wealth inequality in the democratic world. And one thing that we have seen in Britain with the Attlee government, the Labour government, and I'll talk more about them in a couple of lectures from now, they really tried to make a major attempt to engage in redistribution to rid Britain of the status of being the most unequal society in the democratic world. And while there has been a debate about how extensive the welfare state should be, certainly the Conservative Party has wanted a smaller welfare state than the Labour Party. Both British political parties have extended the welfare state well beyond what we see in the United States. So objectively, there's greater class distinctions in the United States than in Great Britain. And yet, despite that, Britain today has much greater subjective class distinctions. That is to say, the British have a much greater sense of social class than the United States does. So working class people live, they dress, they speak differently than middle and upper class people. And a good example of this that I liked from the book is in schooling, because there's no question that British education is deeply divided by class distinctions. And I'll tell you a little bit of a story. At one time, I was the youngest academic director of the Fulbright program in the United States. UC Davis had an academic orientation program, and we had scholars come from all over the world, and we provided them training for being doctoral students, in some cases professors, at universities from throughout the country. So we taught them a little bit about American politics, American history, a little bit about culture, a little bit about how American universities work, etc. So it was a great program. I really loved doing that. And I was involved in the program for, I don't know, 3 years, I believe. And it was intriguing because maybe a decade, maybe even a little bit more than that, somewhere 10, 12, 15 years went by. And I was teaching at Merced College, so I'd left UC Davis, and I have no idea how I was found, but I get a call from Britain, and they're saying, "Are you the Mr. Randall who directed the Fulbright program?" Yes. And well, we were told you might be a good person to talk about education reform. And it was intriguing because the British were considering modeling kind of a second chance college, which would be a combination of career technical education, which they have career tech schools, and to be a bridge to universities in Britain. In other words, they were looking at the community college model as a potential model for Britain. And the British people who interviewed me in this case, it was assistant to a junior minister of education, if I remember correctly. And they were on the phone for quite a while. It was an interesting discussion. I don't think anything became of it, but very intriguing because in this particular case, and it was at a time when there was a labor government. And so there was this desire in Britain to foster greater equity. And certainly, education for me, I believe, is the single best leveler in society. Giving all classes of people in your society access to low cost education is the best way to promote upward mobility. And certainly, I'm a great example of this. I have to believe in it because it happened to me, right? The taxpayers of California invested in me. I got essentially a free, I'm exaggerating slightly, but not much, essentially a free university education. And I went from being in poverty, our family met all of the definitions of poverty, to living now what's called an upper middle class lifestyle. So, certainly in the United States and California, we used to have really cheap universities. Now, not nearly as cheap, but certainly compared to some other parts of the country, California education at the higher ed level, at the college, at the university level is still a very good buy. So I went off track a little bit, but certainly Roskin talks the most about education here. And so basically the haves and the have-nots. And so certainly if you take a look at the haves and you take a look at Great Britain, you look at what they call public schools. In Britain, public schools, and I'll ask you this one on the exam, in Britain, public schools are private boarding schools that are equivalent to American prep schools. They're the schools of the political elites in Britain. Uh, I believe I may have asked the percentage. Only about 7% of young British students attend these schools. But look at the statistic. These really are the training grounds of British leadership. They still make up more than 40% of the students who attend Oxford and Cambridge. These are two of the top 10 universities in the world. They help develop an old boys network, particularly in the Conservative Party, which has governed more often than Labor. Over half of conservative members of parliament went to these private schools, and about half of conservative members of parliament are graduates of either Oxford and Cambridge, and about a quarter of Labor MPs are graduates of these two universities. And of course, the most successful Labor prime minister in the post World War II era, Tony Blair, is a graduate of Oxford, and Tony Blair did go to one of these public schools. So it isn't only conservative leaders, you certainly have labor leaders who have profited from these kind of elite schools, the elite boarding schools, and then the elite universities. On the other hand, what about the have nots? If you take a look at the have nots, only 65% of British 17-year-olds are still in school, the lowest of any advanced democratic society in the world, far less than France or Germany or Japan. And the statistic to me is an interesting one, and it's one that has some personal relevance to me because it's an indicator that British lower class children have faced barriers gaining admission to college. Now, Roskin does balance this by pointing out what I would have to admit is some good news. And the good news is that the percentage of high school graduates going to college has increased significantly in the last few decades. In fact, in percentage terms, has nearly tripled. So even though there has been greater access at the college level, the fact that essentially more than a third of 17-year-olds still are not in school is a danger sign for society. If you are losing that much of your labor pool who is going to be unable to compete in a modern world that is increasingly high tech, that is increasingly computerized. Uh, this is one of the factors that may explain what Roskin goes on to call the British disease, right? Economic decline. Because certainly, if your workforce is not as skilled as your competitors, certainly this is going to create a potential drag on your economy. I want to go down to British political culture. I don't know how far I'm going to get. I have less than 4 minutes left, but the dimension of race and nationalism, and certainly if you've read this section or when you read this section, I don't think it's going to make a whole lot of sense because certainly we live in a very diverse society in the United States, in a society that is becoming increasingly diverse. Certainly, in California, we're even more diverse, much more diverse than the nation as a whole. Both of the colleges that I currently am teaching at Merced College, as well as Cal State Stanislaus, are both Hispanic serving institutions. The largest group in both schools are Hispanic students, they're non white students. And so, from this perspective of America, I think we would say England's a white country. Only 7%, think about that, only 7% of the nation's population is non white. So, certainly, compared to the United States, the dimension of race doesn't seem to be very great. Although, right, we do know that even groups of people in Great Britain that we quote consider white have had historical problems with one another, right? There were wars for centuries between the English and the Scots in Scotland. And of course, the Scots, in nationality terms, right? We talked about nations and states. The Scots still have a lot of nationalistic zeal, as do the Welsh and Wales, right? We have the problem between Northern Ireland and Ireland as a whole, and still tensions between Britain and Ireland. So there certainly are a lot of problems in Great Britain in terms of race as well as nationalism. Now, I do want to hint at one problem before I go, and I'll pick this up in the next mini lecture. But for example, and I'll just use the example of Muslims that I have written in the notes. If you take a look at the Muslim community in the United States, the Muslim community is affluent. They have above average incomes. There are a lot of professional people. They are highly integrated into the community, highly educated, and there are very few perceived problems in the United States compared to Europe. But in Europe, you have a situation where the Muslim community is highly segregated, where they are discriminated against and don't have a lot of opportunities. They are well below average in income, with poverty a major problem. And so there are a lot of problems between the Muslim minority and the white majority because there aren't those cross cutting cleavages that you see in the United States in terms of income, job, education, etc. So I will come back and talk about British political culture in more detail in the second and last mini lecture for this page next time.